Okay, I'm up at my dad's house one last time weighing myself. Obviously, I was too busy yesterday getting home and the festivities to weigh myself. So we do have a bit of Jack in the Box under the belt. I don't think you can put on weight in one night. Maybe you can. Anyway, let's check my final weight. $165.2. Almost back to where I started. That's amazing. That's like pretty much negligible at this point. Either you can put on weight in one night, or I gained back pretty much all my weight by the end. It's pretty easy to attribute this to knowing that that was the last month, so I could just eat whatever I wanted and I didn't have to be rationing food, thinking about making it through another winter. So that's not really representative of the apocalypse. That's just a side effect of the experiment.
So what are my reflections during month 12 of the experiment? So I finally got my deer, and it was interesting to see the success and failure of that. And the thing that I keep saying over and over is that ZAP is about getting ahead of the learning curve before disaster strikes. So for instance, I lost about a third of my deer in my smoking disaster, and in the apocalypse that would be a pretty tragic / life-threatening failure. But now I know that that is not going to work, and thus I'm ahead of the game. I also lost a good amount of my deer meat because I tried to put the meat in with the broth that I was boiling down while I was rendering fat to make soap. I didn't document that, but basically what had happened was that while I was rendering the fat with the bones, it was just all like liquid and fine, but once I put the meat in, then it quit like bubbling around, and the meat ended up settling. And since I was rendering fat for hours and hours and hours and just stirring it occasionally, as the water evaporated, the meat ended up burning on the bottom, and so I was able to use that fat for my soap, but the broth that I was making and all the meat basically was ruined. That's a learning thing, that you need a lot of water in with your meat while you're boiling it so it can kind of churn around. I was working with about a third meat and 2/3 water, and that obviously did not work very well. And also, salting the deer was extremely successful. Really easy if you have salt in quantity, and so that also puts me ahead. I know what works and what doesn't, and that's what this is all about. So I thought that was a pretty cool example, yet again, of the learning curve of what I'm doing and how important it is. I've talked before about how I seem to get extra drunk and ridiculously hungover during the experiment, which I attributed to not eating while I was drinking or not being able to eat the next day. I kind of had this flash this month that I weigh a lot less, and so it's like the booze hits you a lot harder, which makes perfect sense. I don't know why I hadn't thought about that before. And when I looked at the numbers, I actually weigh, like 10 pounds less. You don't think it's a very big deal, but it's actually about 15% of my total body weight that I lost. And so that is a pretty big factor in imbibing. I had a pretty cool experience one night when I was cooking, and I went to reach for some salt, and it was my sea salt, and I was like, wow, that's really cool that I've provided myself with something to make my food taste better. And then next I was reaching for my dried seaweed, and I'm like, wow, that's like something I made too. And it just kept happening, and I was like, wow, it's like my entire pretty much spice pantry and everything around me is almost entirely stuff that I've harvested throughout the year. And in that moment, I really just felt totally successful at what I'm doing and just fulfilled. I was like, this is amazing. I've got freaking stacks of pumpkin seeds and acorn flour and chestnut flour. There's dried bay leaves and dried chanterelles and dried apples and dried pears and dried cinnamon leaves, dried allspice leaves. I've got dried ginger sitting there from the greenhouse. There's dried oregano in bottles and dried thyme, and there's honey from Jenny. And then I've got these jars and jars of olives everywhere. And I don't know, it was just pretty cool to look around and just think, when I'm making a salad, I can put some olives on there, and it really changes the survivability of the apocalypse to have a little bit of stuff that is flavorful. Unfortunately, towards the end of the experiment, particularly in this last month, I found myself not being true to the experiment. Well, I guess being true to the experiment, but not being true to the soul of the experiment, which is trying to act like it isn't lasting just for a year. So like when I cooked pasta throughout the year, I would always drink the pasta broth. Or if I made rice, I would drink the rice broth. Or if I opened a can